For this last portion of the lecture, we are going to look more specifically at some of these cases that we brought up as potential cases of altruism that could be explained through group selection. We're going to determine, utilizing Hamilton's rule, whether the payoffs to the individual are large enough to favor the evolution of these seemingly altruistic behaviors because of this level of inclusive fitness. So we'll start by revisiting aphids. We were talking about how soldiers forego reproduction to help their mother and or their sisters reproduce. Soldiers are produced during an asexual phase of asexual stage of reproduction, and so therefore they are genetically identical to their mothers. We call this parthenogenesis, where species that lay eggs if those eggs are not fertilized, they're able to hatch into genetic clones of their mothers. And so we see this among insects, we see this among some fish that still have asexual reproduction possible. So helping their mother reproduce because they're genetically identical to their mother is equivalent to reproducing themselves. If by protecting the gall they can increase their mother's reproduction more than the reproductive success they'd have reproducing on their own, then their fitness can actually be higher by assuming this non-reproductive role. So we can think about the kind of developmental decision-making process in aphids to be a reaction norm. And that norm would say if you are produced asexually, don't molt, don't become reproductive. This gene could evolve if it produced more copies of itself in siblings than the variant that molts and reproduces. So we can actually see that it's favored genetically because of the fact that we have this genetic identity of these individuals that are produced during this asexual stage. We can look at cooperative breeding among social wasps as as another example of altruism that's favored by kin selection. And so for paper wasps, they can either nest alone or nest together. If they nest together, there are dominant struggles. The more dominant individual produces the most eggs and even eats the eggs of the subordinate individual. The subordinates have a reaction norm that they then reduce the size of their ovaries and produce fewer eggs. And then do the work to feed the offspring of the dominant individual. We have to remember that generally where there's nesting together, it's among sisters. And so paper wasps, like the eusocial ants, like the eusocial bees, have a unique genetic system called haplodiploidy, which results in sisters being related at the 0.75 level, whereas they're related to their own offspring only at the 0.5 level. And so by helping sisters reproduce, they're able to increase their reproductive output by 14.3 offspring, which then offsets the cost in terms of what they'd be able to produce by direct reproduction. And so this unique genetic system of haplodiploidy allows eusocial insects to actually do better off if they help their sisters reproduce versus reproducing on their own. When we look at alarm calls, we talked about how ground squirrels alarm call. We also see alarm calls among prairie dogs. With respect to ground squirrels, we have a breeding system where females remain in their natal troop. That means they stay where they're born. Males disperse by at least the age of adolescence. We find that among ground squirrels, females make alarm calls much more often than males do. Specifically, females will alarm call more often when they are surrounded by their close kin. So, why would we expect, given that males disperse and females stay behind, that females would call more? Well, precisely because females are going to be surrounded by their relatives, because they're going to have their sisters, their mothers, their grandparents, their own offspring, etc., surrounding them. Males potentially would have their own offspring surrounding them, but they're not going to be surrounded by other genetic relatives. And so there are fewer relatives present for males than there are for females. Female ground squirrels make a different decision regarding calling based on who's around them. So when they are surrounded by close kin, that is sisters, mothers, aunts, offspring, they are they're more willing to call. When experiments have been done that have relocated ground squirrels, so they're not surrounded by kin, or in contexts where populations have been combined and there's a lower degree of relatedness among all of the ground squirrels, females call less frequently. So this behavior is absolutely mediated through Hamilton's rule in kin selection. And the rule of thumb here, the reaction norm is, if surrounded by close kin, then alarm call. If surrounded by unrelated individuals, then don't. When we look at those vervet monkeys that had these predator-specific alarm calls, we find that among captive vervets, females will alarm call much more when they are in the presence of kin versus non-kin. Among wild vervets, we see some really interesting changes. Among wild vervets, high-ranking males and females will alarm call more often than low-ranking males. So specifically, we see that low-ranking males are alarm calling less than we expect. Low-ranking individuals will detect predators just as often as high-ranking individuals. They will, if those predators have not been detected by more dominant individuals, they will selectively stay silent. So here you see this kind of decision-making process going on among vervet monkeys, where the rule would say, if you're high-ranking, then alarm call. The rule would say, if you're low-ranking but surrounded by lots of kin, then alarm call. If you're low-ranking and surrounded by unrelated individuals, you might make that decision to selectively stay silent in order to potentially raise the likelihood that someone who outranks you will be picked off by the predator. So we can start to see deceit emerge as we get into really truly social species. We talked about ants and bees being eusocial, but it's genetically programmed. Their behavior is not what we would call Machiavellian or social intelligence, right? They're not deceiving one another and being quote unquote socially savvy. But what we see among species of primates is that we start to use deception as a tool to gain an advantage over the competition. And so we can see that among vervet monkeys with their alarm calls. When we look at adoption among human groups, we find that by and large, adoption is not occurring among unrelated individuals, that it is occurring among a distinct category of individuals. And really, when we look cross-culturally, there's a lot of adoption done in Melanesia and Polynesia. So when we talk about the Hawaiian Islands, for example, when we talk about places like Tahiti, when we talk about Tonga, etc., a really large degree of adoption. But almost all of that adoption takes place at the 0.25 level of relatedness. And so adoption may be common, but it's not common among unrelated individuals. It is generally, in this context, an auntie that will adopt her sister's kin or her sister's kids. And so this is used to help balance out disproportionate kinds of energetic demands. So, if you have an older sister who's already completed her reproductive years, and she might be willing, once her children are already grown, to adopt a few of your kids to help lower your energetic burden, and the burden that comes from having to provision kids. And so, across the board among many, many human populations, this adoption at the 0.25 level is really, really common. Why do we see adoption of unrelated individuals? Well, this only comes later in this kind of post-demographic transition context when people have miscalculated. So if you decide to control reproduction, that is, limit the number of direct offspring you have, but then your offspring end up dying from something like the bubonic plague or the like, you may then adopt unrelated individuals simply to continue your family line. It really is a solution to the problems of inheritance. And so even adoption, though it certainly seems to be altruistic in the sense of giving a child who would otherwise be abandoned a chance at a better upbringing, there are often very very personal reasons, very individually motivated reasons for adoption. When we look at alloparental care, we can look at the FA and childcare to determine who's doing that alloparental care. And so looking at these helpers at the nest among humans, what we find is that females are much more likely, particularly among the sibship, females that are siblings of the child who's being cared for. Females are much more likely to take care of their siblings than are males. But then we find this interesting case that at this degree of relatedness of 0.125, so this is cousins, males are much more likely to provide alloparental care. So in general, a female is going to be taking care of her siblings. Males are not, therefore males are going to take care of their cousins. When we look at the age of the female, and particularly looking at whether they're reproductive or non-reproductive, or we're looking at the reproductive age females. So we're looking at women between about 20 and 50. We find that non-reproductive women are much more likely to provide alloparental care than women who are actually reproducing. And so what does this mean? This means that if you don't have dependent babies of your own, you will help take care of your sister's kids. If you do have your own dependent offspring, you're not going to take care of your sister's kids. You're going to be too busy taking care of your own kids. We also find a relationship between the age of the youngest dependent and the degree to which females help out with alloparental care. If your youngest child is over the age of 6 or 8, you are more likely to help out with alloparental care. If your younger child is under the age of 2, you are a lot less likely to help out with alloparental care. Similarly, we see a relationship between the size of a household and whether or not you help out with alloparental care. If there are very few people in your household, that means you don't have any dependent offspring, or maybe only 1 or 2, you're more likely to help out with alloparental care. If you have 5, 6, 7 offspring, you're not going to help out with alloparental care. So it is a way of equalizing the energetic burden of taking care of these kids. The alloparental care is provided by people who are not actively reproducing, who don't face a huge energetic burden, etc., to help ease the energetic burden of other people in their group, of their siblings, of their cousins, etc. So what does this mean for humans? Well, in pre-state societies, so all of the hunter-gatherer groups we're going to talk about, everything about your social life is governed by kinship rules. Even much of what we do in state-level societies is governed by kinship rules. I mean, you think about if you were to get a phone call from someone asking for $5,000, are you more likely to lend that money to your brother or your parents or your offspring versus a casual acquaintance or even a close friend? I mean, in general, we are more likely to bear a substantial cost to help our family than we are to bear a substantial cost to help acquaintances. This doesn't have anything to do with kin-selected altruism, though. And the reason we make that assertion is because kinship rules are relatively arbitrary. I mean, we think we know what means kin, right? But how many of you have a close family friend that you grew up calling them auntie, right? This is something that's very easy to talk about in New Mexico because there's a high prevalence of it. There are these fictive kin relationships that we determine that have nothing to do with the degree of or the number of genes, copies of genes that we share among one another. Even when we talk about in-laws, right? We treat our in-laws as though they're family, but they're not blood relations, right? Their offspring will be because they're related um, to potentially our spouse, but they themselves are not blood relations of individuals. So this concept of fictive kin across a wide variety of cultures is fairly ubiquitous. We, as a species, preferentially associate with kin for the same reasons that other organisms do. However, we also rely a great deal on what we call reciprocity or reciprocal altruism. This is what happens with friendships, right? We form affiliative relationships, helpful relationships, cooperative relationships, give and take relationships with individuals who are unrelated to us. And we use a different mechanism then for governing those relationships, for making that decision of do we bear this burden, do we bear this cost, than the rules that we make with kin. So we are going to be much more likely, for example, to accept a biased relationship among kin versus among non-kin. So one example we'll talk about with Lecture 5 is Yaquana garden labor exchanges. The Yaquana are a horticultural group in Brazil that means they have small garden plots. That among kin, there can be an imbalance in the number of hours worked. So you might work in your sister's garden for 5 hours, but she might only work in your garden for 1. And we're willing to accept that imbalance. Among non-kin, we see a relationship whereby for every hour that you work in my garden, I'm expected to work in your garden. So we see a more equitable or balanced kind of tit-for-tat relationship. We'll talk about all of those with Lecture 5. So we have, when we're facing this question of do we bear a cost, we have a reaction norm, right? We're willing to bear a bigger cost for kin than non-kin. We expect kind of equal or balanced relationships with non-kin versus kin. So we might give kin longer to pay us back, for example, than if we were giving a loan to non-kin. We have different rules mediating both the size of the burden or the costs that we're willing to bear, as well as any kind of reciprocal or future exchanges that we need to mediate.